Curiosity Collage. What's up, family? Welcome to Curiosity Collage. And yes, this is the Black History Month series. And what we're doing is in this series, just last week we celebrated Mark Vesey's life and talked about some things about what he did in terms of his resistance. But we're looking at celebrating the spirit of active emancipation. And what I mean by that is people who have shown the spirit of resistance in the face of inhumane treatment, inequity, and things of the like. And like I said last week, we did Mark Vesey. This week, Snapshot 2 out of 4 is going to be Gabriel Prosser. And this is another young brother who really stood up on his beliefs, and I think you should check out his story. So let's get right into it. Who was Gabriel? Start with a little background info. His name was actually just Gabriel. He was not Gabriel Prosser. History, out of convenience, has rounded him off to the last name of the person who owned him as an enslaved person, which was Thomas H. Prosser of Henrico County, Virginia. But Gabriel already had a past and an identity. He was just largely unknown before he met Thomas Prosser. So what we do know is that Gabriel was born into slavery around 1775 or 76, around the time of the American Revolution. Now, Gabriel was a young man of great intellect and large stature in his day. By trade, he was a blacksmith, and many attributed his unusually strong build at a very young age to the blacksmith training he received since he was 10 years old. There's not a lot of history about his early childhood days or his parents, but many believe his advanced smithing acumen at an early age was instilled by his dad, who was also believed to be a blacksmith. Gabriel had two brothers, Solomon and Martin. He had a wife as well, all of whom participated with Gabriel, the 24-year-old, 6'2", intellectually gifted man that was able to read as a very, very young child back in slavery days, who also masterminded the first major slave rebellion in United States history on August 30th, 1800 in Richmond, Virginia. Gabriel's combination of brains and brawn allowed him to stand out greatly among his peers and contributed greatly to him commanding respect as a leader from slaves, many of whom were several years his senior. So what happened? What were the main contributing factors that impacted Gabriel's decision to plot a rebellion? Well, a good place to start is around the time when Thomas Prosser, the owner of the Brookfield Tobacco Plantation in Henrico County, passed away in 1798. Prosser's son, Thomas Henry Prosser, inherited his dad's position and became the new master of the plantation at only 22 years of age. A 21-year-old Gabriel suddenly found himself serving a cruel and economically ambitious new master who was barely older than he was. Thomas Henry quickly developed a reputation for pushing his slaves to the brink to fulfill his monetary goals, and in so doing, he began to create a strong animus that was building up within his enslaved population. One of the common practices amongst masters at the time at the various plantations in and around Richmond was the concept of hiring out some of the more skilled enslaved artisans. Now, Gabriel and his brother Solomon were definitely high-skilled artisans, so Thomas Henry began to hire them out. Even though this practice allowed enslaved people a little bit more freedom than some Virginians around town were comfortable with, and despite the fact that there were laws created by the state legislature that were supposed to curtail these types of practices, they typically weren't strongly enforced, if at all. The reason such arrangements were allowed to flourish is because local merchants and artisans grew to rely heavily on the high quality but cheap labor they could get for enslaved tradesmen versus what they would have to pay for the white ones. The white merchants and tradesmen who utilized the cheap labor benefited by saving a buck or two and getting high quality work in return for such a cheap price. But Gabriel and others like him benefited as well. There was an interest convergence happening. He got to travel all around Virginia and get paid for doing so as an enslaved person. The type of mobility that he enjoyed in general, including the fact that he was compensated for his labor, gave him a semblance of freedom. He got to taste a little freedom that he was able to enjoy. He also got to be in the company of a diverse range of people as he shared tasks and enjoyed leisure time. Because not only the other hired enslaved tradesmen were free blacks as well, and other white laborers. Such socializing was very threatening to the powers that be in the various Virginia cities, who were always paranoid about the potential damage that could be done to their control and their authority by virtue of such a vast network of relationships being allowed to thrive under their noses. So to mitigate the threat, There were several laws on the books focused on curtailing the socializing between enslaved and free blacks. But bonds were invariably formed between enslaved and free blacks along with working class whites, especially in cities where the upper crust wealthy whites were in a minority. And although there was overwhelming discrimination, several free black-owned businesses and interracial grog shops managed to prosper. However, due to suspicion of threatening activities, many of these establishments were often raided, including the interracial grog shops. The milieu inhabited by Gabriel definitely shaped his political consciousness, his sense of identity, as well as his overall worldview. Being not so far removed from the actual American Revolution meant that conversations that he would have been privy to and exposed to in that period would have been rife with revolution-filled rhetoric that accompanied it, including concepts such as freedom, justice, and equality in the face of tyrannical rule. The uprisings in Saint-Domingue in 1791, now known as Haiti, also contributed heavily to his resistance-laden sensibilities and provided him with a real-time example of how black resistance could look and how powerful it could be in the face of white oppression. The success and self-sufficiency of the free blacks, as well as his own contempt of the unfair merchants who always looked to cheat the enslaved tradesmen, were huge motivating factors. The working class folk that he rubbed elbows with as he worked also provided him with a constant earful of anti-establishment rhetoric. And last but certainly not least was Gabriel's own yearning to be emancipated from the lowly chattel condition that he and his people had to endure. These varied influences shaped Gabriel's resistive sensibilities and provided valuable strength and justification to his resolve to act on them. Each day he was exposed to these influences brought him closer to the idea of revolution as his only option towards liberation from the subhuman treatment he was then receiving. As an enslaved person, Gabriel endured several affronts over time, on his humanity and things. But however, there's always that one straw that proverbially breaks the camel's back, of course. And in this case, it had to do with a pig and an overseer. Of course, no pun intended, right? In September of 1799, Gabriel, his brother Solomon, along with another enslaved man named Jupiter, literally stole a pig. However, they wound up getting caught by a white overseer named Absalom Johnson. Gabriel and the overseer began to fight. Gabriel ultimately wrestled him to the ground and won the advantage over the overseer by hitting him with the old Mike Tyson move. Yup, he bit off Absalom's ear. When they went to court, Gabriel was found guilty of maiming a white man, a capital offense. However, there was a loophole Gabriel was able to use. There was a defense called benefit of the clergy, or benefit of clergy. See, if Gabriel was able to recite a full verse from the Bible, then he could exchange the verdict of execution for a public branding in his left hand. So, being literate like he was, he successfully recited his verse and then was publicly branded in open court. With a fresh brand in his left hand, Gabriel was then ordered to immediately spend a month in jail. His fire for rebellion was now fully lit. With a nice amount of time to think and reflect, Gabriel began to fully submit to his desire to be emancipated. He had been greatly inspired by the fearless uprisings by the blacks in Saint-Domingue. And on top of that, thoughts of a society based on true equality, as constantly expressed by the working class men with whom he worked, also played over and over in his head. He decided that it was time to finally act on these thoughts and feelings. Gabriel had now developed the belief that if the people who were enslaved stood up and fought for their rights as humans, then the poor working class whites would join them. So what would standing up actually look like? Well, Gabriel got his thoughts together and devised a plan. It all starts with a plan. What he came up with was as follows. He intended on seizing Capitol Square in Richmond, taking Governor James Monroe as hostage, to use as a bargaining chip with the city authorities. Then he would send one of his trusted, more persuasive men to the nation of Indians called the Catawbas in order to persuade them to join the cause of fighting against and overthrowing the white people. There was also a French army nearby that was landed at South Key that he truly believed would be inclined to join in and assist them against the white powers that be in Richmond once they saw the Indians and blacks were rising up against the establishment. Gabriel decided that in the tradition of blacks of Saint-Domingue, Haiti, his banner would also mimic their battle cry of
death or liberty. Gabriel got quickly busy assembling his team of conspirators who would recruit men to carry out the mission. He told his brother Solomon and another of Prosser's enslaved men named Ben. Now remember Ben. Remember Ben. Other men entered the fray as recruiters from that point, including Jack Ditcher and this other Ben named Ben Woolfolk. Remember him too. They maintained a strict policy of no women in the ranks. But they did manage to recruit free blacks and a few white workers to the cause, especially in Richmond. Two militant abolitionists who were also French entered their ranks as leaders, namely Charles Percy and Alexander Beddenhurst. They recruited men from all over Virginia, including Petersburg, Norfolk, and Albemarle. They were also able to get men from Caroline and Louisa counties early. And finally, after some initial hesitancy, they were able to successfully draw in men from Henrico County, where the plantation was. This was to be the largest and most far-reaching slave revolt ever recorded in U.S. history. They amassed plenty of weapons as they began molding bullets and hammering swords out of scythes. By August 1800, their liberation army was ready. The plan had now become a little more sophisticated since they had grown larger in size and expanded to include taking down Norfolk as well as St. Petersburg by the men living there. Gabriel set the initial date of the takeover to be on the night of Saturday, August 30th. As the word was being delivered, though, to all the outlying areas, rumors of what was about to go down started circulating among the whites, and eventually made it all the way up to Governor Monroe, who actually ignored the warnings. Saturday, August 30th finally came, but it was raining cats and dogs outside. The roads were impassable due to the torrential downpour. Now, a few men still gathered at the appointed meeting spot, but it soon became clear that it was, a no-go due to the weather, and they would have to regroup and try again a little later. So Gabriel and his crew decided to postpone it until Sunday, Sunday evening on the 31st. However, tragically, as fate would have it, two men cracked under the pressure of the imminent rebellion. And on the next day, they told their masters of the plan. The governor was again alerted, but this time he took it seriously. White patrols began scouring the hillsides looking for the rebels, and they were soon joined by the militia. Gabriel and Jack Ditcher somehow evaded arrest for several days, but by September 9th, over 30 slaves were being held in a special court where there is no benefit of a jury called oyer interminar, loosely translated to listen and finish. When the trials began on 9/11, Gabriel and Ditcher were still at large. The white authorities still had no idea of how extensive the plot was, but the white Virginians were terrified nonetheless at the thought of how close that threat came and the idea that they still didn't know how extensive it was. One of their biggest fears, because it was a fear of that time period in general, but one of their biggest fears was that slaves would use brute force to overwhelm the men and rape the white women. The white authorities, despite desperate for intel, had to use guile to obtain information which was not readily forthcoming. So they offered a full pardon to a handful of slaves who were willing to, give testimony against others who might have been involved. In other words, turn state. Two witnesses emerged this way, including the man named Ben, that I told you about earlier, who was one of Prosser's enslaved men, and the other Ben Woolfolk. Prosser's Ben came forward first and gave testimony that sent a number of enslaved men from that area to the gallows, including both of Gabriel's brothers, Solomon and Martin. But he didn't have enough knowledge of the outlying areas, so they had to rely on Ben Woolfolk for that testimony. On September the 14th, Gabriel finally emerged in the James River and swam to a schooner called Mary. He asked to see the captain, who was a white man named Richardson Taylor. Two black men on board, Isham, who was Taylor's former slave, and a presently enslaved man named Billy, let the captain know that Gabriel, he was indeed the leader of the plot. But even though Taylor was a former overseer, he had a change of heart, and he was actually about to take Gabriel to freedom. But when the ship finally docked in Norfolk, Billy alerted the authorities to Gabriel's presence on board in hopes of collecting that $300 reward that was promised for Gabriel's capture. Billy's move to rat out Gabriel resulted in the arrest of both Gabriel and Captain Taylor. Billy did get a reward, but it was only a measly $50, nowhere near enough to buy his freedom that like he was hoping for. So he basically sold out for nothing. On October 6th, Gabriel was put on trial. Several witnesses came forward, but Gabriel never said a word. He didn't crack. He was sentenced to be executed the next day, but asked them to commute his sentence to October 10th so he could be executed with 6 other slaves who would have hanged on that day. The court agreed, but when the 10th came, they hanged the men in 3 different locations. Gabriel was actually hanged all alone in the town gallows. The trials lasted about 2 months, with 26 enslaved men being executed by hanging, and at least 65 men were tried at that time. Of those not hanged, some were transported to other states, and amongst those, some were found not guilty, and some were actually pardoned. By law, slaveholders had to be reimbursed for their lost property, so the state of Virginia wound up spending $8,900 to those slaveholders for executing their slaves, which of course was an enormous sum back in those days, about equivalent to $225K today, comparatively speaking. Most blacks were tried in Richmond, but those tried in other states shared the same fate as those who in Richmond pretty much. However, in Hanover County, 2 blacks escaped with the help of blacks outside the prison, and they were never recovered. They questioned whites as well as blacks in Norfolk County trying to find witnesses, but no one, including those that were accused, came forward with evidence, and the enslaved men that were accused had to be released. In Petersburg, they arrested 4 free black men, but they also had to be released due to lack of witnesses who could testify against them. But of course there were, however, enslaved men who were willing to testify against the free brothers, but testimony from those enslaved against free people was inadmissible in Virginia courts. So there you have it, another brave heart who went to great lengths to resist the structural inequality that demoralized him and his people. A man who galvanized and inspired a whole army to pick up arms and fight for their freedom, even in the face of impending death. A story about a courageous, super intelligent, highly skilled young leader and a warrior who stood up and refused to live as an enslaved human any longer. A story about a black martyr who in the end was literally sold out for crumbs by his own people. So long live the spirit of Gabriel and his brothers Solomon and Martin. And once again, men who made the ultimate sacrifice for the ideals of freedom, justice, and equality. So I leave you as I came in peace. I'm enjoining you to come to us next time for the 2nd or the 3rd snapshot of the Black History Month series, where we celebrate the spirit of active emancipation. And like I said, I leave you as I came in peace. This is Brother and Dr. Garfield Bright, signing off from Curiosity Collage. Peace. One love, y'all.